So I'm going to talk about urbanism, and I'm really going to talk about spaghetti, Vegematics, and this bench as how they've contributed to, I guess, what we call urbanism on Governor's Island, but really how, as Tina alluded to, how we went from being this abandoned place, right? No one had ever been here. It didn't even exist on the map. One of the things we like to say is, you know, if you can't get to a place in New York City by subway or taxi, it doesn't exist. And that was certainly the case when I started 7 years ago. So I have props. I was very excited that there was no PowerPoint, so I'm actually using props. I found this, actually, quinoa in the back of my quinoa gluten-free spaghetti as my first prop in my cabinet this morning. So why is spaghetti relevant to Governor's Island? So when we started 7 years ago, this literally was a place that not only had no one ever been, but really there was no reason to come here. This is a former military base, and if you're a military history buff, this is pretty low on the sort of ranking of interesting things happening. So this is not Fort Sumter. You know, there's no shots were ever fired here. So we started with the approach that for what we love about cities is that they're messy. How many people grew up in this city? A few of you. How many people obviously moved here from somewhere else, right? So you come to New York because it's messy, it's complicated, all kinds of things surprise you. Well, that's pretty hard to do in a former military base where no one's allowed to live. And so we took the approach of how do we make this messy? And we made this messy by what we call throwing spaghetti against the wall. And what we mean by that is when you come to Governor's Island, and so if you come this weekend, if you come tomorrow, you can go to a carousel festival, you can meet a guy who's passionate about interactive math, you can pet the bunnies in our composting program, you can tour our park, you can meet people who are passionate about historic costume. These are, you can see the New York Historical Society, there's a long list of things you can do. None of those things are things that you can do together in any other place, and they all came about because basically we were completely open to anything that could happen here. So if you have an organization and you come to us, and Linda Realmuto, who's in the audience, we basically say, hi, you're really passionate about math, great. What kind of space would you like? Would you like this old house? Here are the keys. You can do whatever you want on the inside. Just give us a poster so we can tell visitors about it and have at it. We don't presuppose what's going to be interesting, and we don't curate, select, or fund anything that happens here. And what's happened as a result is that all kinds of groups have come to Governor's Island and created amazing experiences. And so they're what I call programming entrepreneurs. So if you come tomorrow and you go into math, you'll meet a guy who really loves math, and you go to composting, you'll talk to Marissa. And these are people who have a deep passion for what they do, and what their compensation is sharing it with you. And there really isn't another place they can do that. And so on a typical day, 500 people will pop in and say hi to the math guy. That's pretty incredible. But what's really more important about that is that I work for the government, and it is very important that we who work in the government are completely open-minded about what can happen. When we started here, a lot of people expected us to come up with a grand master plan. What will Governor's Island be? And we just said that's not really the way that cities work, right? Cities work because we all move and we switch neighborhoods. Jamie and I were just discussing what neighborhood. She's joining our team next week, and she's moving from DC. We were just having like the neighborhood debate, Brooklyn versus this. And that's what makes cities interesting, is that they change, and they change because of all of you and what you do in them. And now in a world where you can get 1,000 people to come to Governor's Island for Pig Island without, spending a dime on marketing because you're using social media, that means that these programming entrepreneurs can find their audience, and we welcome them. So spaghetti is our metaphor. We talk about it all the time because we throw spaghetti against the wall all the time. Sometimes it sticks, and it can be really tasty. Lots of times it doesn't. But we are completely open to what will result from that. And that's, I think, really the hallmark to what we do here, which is, I think, very different than what you see in a lot of other public spaces. We'll have a helicopter pause. And cultural institutions. And I think really important when you think about what urbanism is, I don't even know what the definition is, but it's about why do cities work? And cities work because creative people gather in them and make them interesting. And having lived in other cities and having had colleagues who live in the suburbs and the difference in the life when I worked in a suburb in terms of the messiness. And again, if you think about a plate of spaghetti, when it's tasty, it's still very messy. So that's my first lesson of urbanism is why throwing spaghetti. Now this is a Vegematic. And I'm sure you're wondering why I have a Vegematic. Does anyone know what a Vegematic is? So this is So a Vegematic slices, wedges, and dices. And I actually have purchased several of these for my team. So this is my preview. And why I am always talking to my team and saying, think Vegematic. Why would I say that? Because if, for those of you who eons ago watched late night TV, or there used to be this amazing man in Union Square who passed away several years ago, who used to sit on the sidewalk. Does anyone remember him? And this very nattily attired 90-year-old man who was selling basically the 21st century equivalent of a Vegematic. It turned out he lived on Park Avenue, and there was a whole incredible backstory about him. But the virtue of the Vegematic is that it has attributes, right? It's really clear what it does. And the challenge that I see in the worlds of design and the worlds of urban policy is that people use language that doesn't relate to what actually people do. And so depending on what field of design you're in, there's different sort of language in different ghettos. So I work a lot with landscape architects, and they have a phrase called desire lines. Does anyone know what a desire line is? Exactly. Right? Somebody back there? Do you know what a desire line is? Can you say? A path that people favor. So basically where I want to go. So I don't allow landscape architects to use the phrase desire lines when they're talking to me about the new park on Governor's Island, because actually what I want to talk about is like, where do people want to go? Do you want to go this way? Do you want to go that way? Architects have different language, moves. Everybody know what a move is, right? Interventions. And so what happens when you're designing, and whether you're the designer, in my case, I'm the client, you start to use all this language that doesn't actually relate to what you are making. And whether you're making a product, whether you're making a website, whether you're making a park. And so I am always reminding my team, be direct, right? Think of that guy in Union Square. If you sat down with him, he could explain what that product was. Now, the truth is, I hope our park is more successful than Vegematics, because if you go to yard sales on Long Island, you can buy a lot of these. And they're very cheap, and I have bought several in the last few weekends. But it really is, it chops, slices, and dices. It's not a desire line. And so what I think is incredibly important in everything that we do on Governor's Island is that we always speak the way that humans speak. And we do that when we are in design meetings. We do that when we're at public meetings. And I was debating whether to bring George Orwell as a prop or a Vegematic. And I was going to title the talk, why George Orwell is like a Vegematic. Because George Orwell, I think one of the greatest writers who ever lived, talks a lot about language and how using language appropriately, if using language inappropriately, corrupts in the same way that other things corrupt. So it's an incredibly important point, I think, in design, because I was just doing a crit at Columbia. And so there were like 6 architects, me, and these students. And I just couldn't understand sometimes what people were saying, my fellow jurors, because they were deep in architecture language. And I kept on saying, how will you experience this building? I call it at foot level, right? So here's a building, there's like these beautiful renderings, and only a bird can see those renderings. And instead, when you walk into a building, right, you look at it from your foot level out. And again, as we work in design processes, if we use language that doesn't map to how people will chop, slice, and dice, or how they will walk in a park, we get farther and farther from what it is, and we end up designing for each other and not actually for the consumer or the public. And so my team will all be the recipients of Vegematics of their own shortly. This is the first one. But really as a way to remind all of us that we have to speak clearly. The other sort of metaphor I often use is, in my land, people talk a lot about engagement, right? Citizen engagement, public engagement. And we have a rule that you're not allowed to use the word engagement unless there's a new ring on your finger. And that's because, I have never heard a human sitting at a bar say, I'm part of the engagement process of planning, blah, blah, blah. No one ever uses that word except for bureaucrats and people doing public involvement processes. So my first lesson in sort of urbanism is be messy. Throw spaghetti, don't be surprised if it doesn't stick, be really happy when it does, and keep on throwing it. Because we throw spaghetti every day here. And we throw spaghetti when we're thinking about programming, we throw spaghetti when we think about design. And then, of course, as you're designing, think about that guy, that incredible guy sitting in Union Square selling Vegematics. So my third prop is actually this bench. And this bench usually lives at Picnic Point, which is actually not open this season, so I haven't seen it in a little while. So this really gets to the heart of how we have designed the new park and public spaces on Governor's Island. So I've been working here for about 7 years, and we hired an extraordinary landscape architecture firm led by a man named Adrian Hoyza. And in his interview, he had this insight, and this is back in January of 2007. And he said, I think the spaces on Governor's Island should have movable furniture. Because, and he's Dutch, and I can't replicate his Dutch accent, but he basically said that will enable people to colonize the island and feel ownership of the island. So it just really stuck with me. And so we found on the web, actually, some open source plans for a movable bench. And we actually had people who work on the island build these benches. So these are not really designed, and they didn't cost very much. And I will, for a moment, just demonstrate how they move. Okay, great. Why does that matter, right? They're cool, right? They matter because, so we put out a bunch of these benches, right? And we're working on designing the park in Governor's Island. And what do we discover? This will be really obvious. People prefer shade. Is that like earth-shattering to you? And so we put, kind of earth-shattering to some designers, right? Who are designed this very large, dramatic scene from a bird, mosaic plaza on the southern tip of Governor's Island. And we were like, we've been watching people, and they keep on moving the benches to the shade. So maybe we need some more shade. And that, again, seems incredibly obvious, but we literally watched people and what they did. But the other thing that they did was they took the movable furniture and they did exactly what Adrian had said. So when people come to Governor's Island, you'll see it. We have, in addition to these benches, you'll see Adirondack chairs, you'll see hammocks, and you'll see furniture that basically people are invited to take that furniture and move it and create whatever kinds of spaces they want. And so, of course, in parks, right, if you go to Central Park or Union Square Park or you name a park, what is a park? How do you sit in a park, right? You sit on a bench with a back. And that makes total sense in those places. But what we found as we were designing our park and at the same time welcoming people to Governor's Island was that people aren't here, you're not coming to Governor's Island on the way to work and sitting down on a bench to drink your, coffee. You're not here walking your dog, right? We're not on the way to anywhere, if you've noticed. So instead you come here and you hang out. And so when you come and you hang out, you come with your friends and you come with your family, and you take our furniture and you move it places. And so we deliberately encourage that. And so when you'll see as you walk around the island, probably not our new Adirondack chairs, but some other chairs, we actually tested them so that they would be the right weight, right, that they could survive you moving them around, but also that you could literally pick them up. So that was like one of our tests. So we tested all of the furniture that's going in the new park, literally not just on the normal things of like, is it durable, but can you pick it up and move it and form a grouping? The other sort of signature of the island with our benches, and I'll tell you about the pirate wedding, which is my favorite use of this bench, is hammocks. And so at the same time that we put these benches out there and we watched people move them around, we had this idea of putting hammocks on Governor's Island. And that's, again, not really rocket science. But it turned out that nobody had ever put a hammock in a public space before. So we went online and we bought a bunch of hammocks, just the same way you would buy them for your backyard. And we put them out. And what we discovered was that many children in New York have never seen a hammock. And it was fascinating to watch, right? So, and I'm really sorry to say this, but there was actually a gender division. So boys would dive bomb into the hammocks and try to flip them over instantly. Girls would kind of like touch them and like go like this. And then, of course, the image that we had of hammocks was like the sort of backyard pastoral, you fall asleep in a hammock, you read a book. Well, hammocks play a different role on Governor's Island because lots of people plop in them together, and then people take our benches, they take our hammocks, and they make like little outposts. And they have lunch, and they hang out, and they've used them way more than that image. And so and of course we have a new space on Governor's Island called Hammock Grove, which is inspired by this use. But really the point here is that you can learn so much from experimenting. And again, we just thought this was like a cool thing. But this bench is why there's going to be a lot more grass on Governor's Island than cement, right? So if you were parsing through our master plan from 3 years ago, you'll notice that there's more cement in that plan than there is in what we're building. But it also taught us how people really use this space. And we learned that in ways that we didn't expect to. And that, I think, is really important when you're doing design, which is how do you really watch what people are doing and then sort of discuss, like, what is it that you saw? So when we were doing Adirondack chairs for the park, I was with a designer, we were like riding our bikes around, and he goes, well, like, we should have like a cup holder. Like, people want to put their cups on the arms of their Adirondack chair. And I said, well, actually, I've never seen anyone do that. So we're not putting a cup holder. This is not a car. And he sort of assumed something, and I said, but no, what's important about this Adirondack chair is that it's an icon of summer. And what we want this Adirondack chair to be is that connection between you, the visitors coming to Governor's Island to hang out for 2 hours, and your feeling of summer. And so, in fact, we have an undesigned, or not designed by our landscape architect, Adirondack chair going into the park because we wanted that Adirondack chair to really channel and connect back to sort of what an Adirondack chair has always been. But finally, I will conclude with my pirate wedding story. So we have these benches, right? People move them around. They're fun. So I'm at work one Saturday, and I get an email that says there are pirates on the ship, on the ferry. And for a second, I actually thought there were pirates. I mean, like, I don't know. But there were people dressed as pirates. And it turned out there was a pop-up wedding on Governor's Island. And they had been very organized, so they had a pop-up potluck, right? So people were bringing food, and they had decided to take these benches and organize them like pews. And so they had gotten here early, and they had arranged all the benches, like sort of looking at the Statue of Liberty. But then somehow the groom's friends had decided to be pirates and had somehow not told the bride or her family. So you had these pirates, like they had bicycles decorated like pirate ships, and they were in pirate garb, pouring off the boat. And then you had these people who were like, sort of dressed like me, a little, probably floral, not black, coming to a pop-up potluck wedding on Governor's Island. And then there was this like saber fight among I think the 2 best men or whatever it was. I mean, it was just mesmerizing. But I have to tell you that I never would have thought that you could use these benches as pews for a wedding. So that's the ultimate lesson for me, is put stuff out there, experiment, improvise, speak clearly, and just totally enjoy how people use your products, your designs, your public spaces, and then improve them based on what you're watching. So that's my version of urbanism on Governor's Island. I know that I wanted to have time for questions and conversation, so I'll sit on the bench and wait for questions. It's very comfortable as well.